In the late summer of 2009, I was a 22-year-old recent college graduate, embarking on what I believed to be an adventurous hiking trip across the Appalachian Trail. My journey started in the northern part of Georgia, aiming to traverse through its dense forests and challenging terrains, hoping to find a bit of myself along the way. I am male, and at that time I was fueled by youthful exuberance and a desire to escape the pressure of finding a job and settling into adulthood. The first few days were exhilarating. The connection with nature, the simplicity of life on the trail, and the occasional friendly hiker provided a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. However, as I ventured deeper into the wilderness away from the more frequented paths, I began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. This feeling was compounded late one evening, about a week into my journey, when I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin, seemingly forgotten by time. Intrigued and admittedly a bit weary from the day's hike, I decided to investigate. The cabin was in a state of disrepair, with rotting wood and vines creeping up its sides. Despite the unease that gripped me, curiosity won over, and I pushed the creaking door open. Inside, the cabin was bare except for a rustic table, a fireplace filled with old ashes, and a peculiar dusty journal lying on the floor. Compelled by an unknown force, I picked up the journal. The entries were dated back to the early 2000s, and as I flipped through the pages, the content grew increasingly disturbing. The writer, whose name was never mentioned, detailed their growing obsession with stalking hikers on the Appalachian Trail. They described in chilling detail how they would watch from a distance, follow for days, and fantasize about the fear in their victims' eyes once they realized they were not alone. A sense of dread washed over me as I read. The realization that I could be the subject of someone's twisted obsession felt all too real, isolated as I was. The final entry was dated just weeks before my trip began, ending with a haunting promise to return to the trail soon. Panic set in. The isolation I had once sought now felt like a trap. Every rustle in the trees became a potential threat, every shadow a place for someone to hide. I spent a sleepless night in the cabin, jumping at the slightest sound, regretting my decision to venture so far off the beaten path. As dawn broke, I made the decision to abandon my journey and head back to civilization. The trek back was torturous, fueled by paranoia and the fear that I was being followed. Every hiker I passed was a potential suspect, every friendly gesture a possible facade. It took me several days to reach an area where I could finally get a signal on my phone and call for a ride. During those days, I spoke to no one. My trust in strangers shattered by the contents of that journal. This experience has stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. The Appalachian Trail, with all its beauty and majesty, now holds a sinister note in my memory. I sometimes wonder about the author of the journal, whether they were merely writing a work of fiction or if, somewhere out there, they watched me read their words and smiled. In the autumn of 2015, I found myself living in a small, picturesque town in the Scottish Highlands. At the age of 25, having just completed my master's degree, I moved there for what was supposed to be a temporary teaching position at the local high school. I'm a woman who, at the time, was seeking solitude and a break from the bustling city life of Glasgow, where I'd spent the last several years studying. The town, enveloped by rolling hills and dense forests, seemed like the perfect escape. My rented cottage was on the outskirts of the town, a charming, if somewhat isolated, stone building that looked like it had stood there for centuries. The nearest neighbor was a good half-mile away, which I initially found appealing. The serenity of the place was palpable, with mornings greeted by a symphony of birds and nights cloaked under a blanket of stars, untainted by city lights. However, this isolation soon became the source of an unnerving experience. About a month into my stay, I began to notice small, odd occurrences. It started with things being slightly out of place. A book moved from the shelf to the table. A window left ajar when I was certain I had closed it. Initially, I dismissed these as the result of my own forgetfulness. Then, one evening, as I returned home from school, I found a small, intricately carved wooden figure sitting on my doorstep. It was a detailed carving of an owl, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the dwindling light. No note, no indication of who left it there or why. Its sudden appearance was both intriguing and unsettling. Over the following weeks, more figures appeared. Each was different. A fox, a deer, a hare, each placed at my doorstep, always appearing when I was away. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but the lack of explanation for their origin began to weigh heavily on me. The local police, when approached, could offer no advice beyond suggesting they were gifts from an admirer, perhaps a student fond of my classes. The quaint charm of my isolated cottage began to feel more like a cage, each new figure a reminder of unseen eyes, always watching. The turning point came late one October night. I was jolted awake by the sound of someone whispering my name through the darkness. The voice was soft, almost loving, but it filled the room from no discernible source. I sat frozen in bed, straining against the silence that followed, but the voice did not come again. And the next morning I found no new figure on my doorstep, but the sense of being watched had intensified. Questions raced through my mind. Who was doing this? What did they want from me? I realized then that the beauty of the Highlands, with its vast expanses and secluded corners, could also serve as a perfect stage for someone with malicious intent. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, of being exposed and alone in a way that the city's anonymity never allowed. The decision to leave came swiftly. Within a week, I had packed my belongings and moved back to the bustling safety of Glasgow. To this day, the mystery of the wooden figures remains unsolved. I sometimes wonder about the person behind them, their motives cloaked in the guise of artistic expression. The experience taught me that isolation can be a double-edged sword, offering peace at the cost of security. And sometimes the most haunting threats are those rooted not in the supernatural, but in the very real presence of another human being, whose intentions are hidden in the shadows of our own fears. In the spring of 2018, I was living the life of a digital nomad, moving from one European city to another every few months. By April, I found myself in a quaint, albeit somewhat eerie, small town in rural Romania. I was a 28-year-old man at the time, originally from Toronto, Canada, seeking adventure and stories to fuel my freelance writing career. The town, nestled within the shadowy embrace of the Carpathian Mountains, was rich in folklore and history, a perfect setting for someone like me, chasing the thrill of the unknown. My accommodation was a modest rented room in an old house that had been converted into a guest house. The building, centuries old, creaked and groaned with the weight of its own history. The owner, an elderly woman named Mariana, lived on the ground floor, while I and two other travelers occupied the rooms above. Mariana was a descendant of the original owners, and her family stories were as woven into the fabric of the town as the cobblestone streets themselves. One evening, over a cup of local herbal tea, Mariana shared tales of the town's past, including a particularly chilling story about the Watcher in the Woods. According to legend, a figure had been seen roaming the forests surrounding the town for centuries, always at dusk, watching the townsfolk from afar. Dismissed by many as mere superstition, some believed it was the spirit of a man wronged by the villagers long ago, forever bound to watch over them. Intrigued and somewhat skeptical, I decided to venture into the woods the next day, camera in hand, hoping to capture the essence of the place, if not the Watcher himself. The forest was dense, with light struggling to pierce through the thick canopy above. It was easy to see how local legends could find their footing in such a place. Hours passed as I explored, lost in the beauty and serenity of the natural world, yet finding nothing out of the ordinary. As dusk began to settle, I decided to head back, slightly disappointed. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes behind me, subtle, but distinct in the quiet of the forest. Turning around, I expected to see a deer, or perhaps a wild dog, but there was nothing there. As I continued on my way, the rustling followed, always just out of sight, keeping pace with me. A cold dread began to take hold, the thrill of adventure turning into a primal fear of being hunted. I started to run, the rustling turning into heavy, deliberate steps. I burst out of the tree line just as the last light of day faded, never once looking back until I reached the safety of the guest house. Out of breath and shaken, I recounted my experience to Mariana, who listened with a solemn nod. "You've seen the Watcher," she said, a hint of sorrow in her voice. "Or rather, he has seen you. It's rare, but it happens to those who venture into the woods with disbelief in their hearts." I spent the rest of my stay in Romania avoiding the forest, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving me. The experience changed something in me, a realization that not all stories are meant to be chased, and some legends are rooted in truths best left undisturbed. To this day, I wonder about the nature of the Watcher, whether a figment of collective imagination or something far more tangible. But some mysteries I've learned are better left unsolved. their answers lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. In the winter of 2020, amidst the global turmoil of a pandemic, I found myself in a desolate part of Alaska, working on a research project related to climate change. I am a 32-year-old female scientist, usually based in San Francisco, who had been drawn to the stark beauty and isolation of the Arctic landscape as a means to focus on my work without the distractions of the outside world. The project was to last 3 months, stationed at a remote research facility with a small team of dedicated professionals. The research station was a compact, functional structure, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a long, treacherous drive through the frozen wilderness. The team consisted of myself, 2 other scientists, and a logistics coordinator named Alex, who was responsible for our supplies and communication with the outside world. In the beginning, the isolation felt liberating. The endless expanse of snow and ice, the auroras dancing across the night sky, and the silence, profound and untouched, was intoxicating. However, as the weeks passed, the isolation began to wear on us. Conversations grew shorter, and the darkness of the winter months seemed to seep into our moods. One evening, a few weeks into our project, Alex reported that our communication equipment was malfunctioning. We were effectively cut off from the outside world until the next supply run, which was weeks away. While initially unsettling, we were well prepared for such eventualities, or so we thought. The first sign that something was amiss came when supplies started to go missing. At first, it was small things. A can of food here, a tool there. We attributed it to carelessness or misplacement. But then, the missing items grew more significant, and it became clear that something, or someone, was taking them. Tensions within the team rose, accusations were made, and trust began to erode. The once cohesive group started to fracture, with each of us retreating into our own spheres of suspicion and fear. It was during this time of heightened anxiety that I discovered tracks in the snow, leading away from the station into the wilderness. They were unmistakably human, but none of us had ventured outside in the previous days. The realization that someone else was out there watching us, perhaps even entering the station, sent a chill down my spine. One night, the situation escalated. I awoke to the sound of someone moving through the station. I quietly left my room, heart pounding, expecting to confront one of my team members, only to find a figure rifling through our supplies in the common area. It was not Alex or any of the other scientists. This person was a stranger, rugged and wild-looking, with a haunting gaze that met mine in the dim light. Before I could react, the figure dashed out into the darkness, leaving me frozen in place. When I finally raised the alarm, Alex and the others were incredulous until they saw the tracks and the disturbed supplies for themselves. The next days were filled with a palpable sense of dread. We fortified the station best we could and took turns keeping watch at night. The stranger did not return, or if they did, they left no trace. Eventually, our communication equipment was repaired, and we reported the incident, but due to our remote location, help was slow to arrive. When our project finally came to an end, and we were able to leave the station, the relief was overwhelming. However, the experience left a lasting impression on me. The realization that we were not alone, that someone had been out there in the vast wilderness, watching us and perhaps needing help, but choosing instead to remain a silent, unseen presence, was deeply unsettling. The wilderness of Alaska is unforgiving and beautiful, but it also hides secrets in its silence. Who the stranger was, what they wanted, and how they survived out there, I'll never know. But the memory of their eyes filled with a wild, untamed longing haunts me to this day. In the humid summer of 2016, I found myself settling into the quiet life of a small coastal town in South Carolina, having taken up a position as a librarian. At 27, having lived in the hustle of New York City for most of my life, the tranquility of the town was both a welcome and eerie change. I'm female, and the move was part of a deliberate attempt to escape the frenetic pace and noise of urban living for a while. The town, draped in Spanish moss and steeped in history, seemed like the perfect backdrop for a period of self-reflection and writing, which I hope to pursue alongside my work. My home was an old, 2-story Victorian house near the outskirts of town, a place with enough character and quirks to feed my imagination. The locals, warm and welcoming, were full of stories about the town's past, from tales of Revolutionary War heroes to ghost stories that seemed obligatory for such an historic setting. However, it wasn't long before the idyllic peace I had found in the town gave way to a sense of unease. It started with small, inexplicable occurrences, objects within the house moving seemingly on their own, doors creaking open in the dead of night, and the distinct feeling of being watched. I attributed these to the age of the house and my own overactive imagination, bolstered by the ghost stories that were a staple of local folklore. This sense of unease took a tangible turn one evening, a few months into my stay. Returning home from the library, I found a series of photographs slipped under my front door. They were Polaroids, each depicting a different room of my house, taken from the inside. The photos were recent, evidenced by the placement of furniture and personal items. There was no note, no indication of who might have taken them or why. I reported the incident to the local police, but without any signs of forced entry or clear evidence of who could be responsible, there was little they could do. The following nights were restless ones, each creak and whisper of wind through the old house setting my nerves on edge. Then, 2 weeks after the photographs appeared, I came home to find something far more disturbing. A note left on my dining room table, in the same place where one of the Polaroids had shown it to be bare just days before. The note was simple, chilling in its brevity. "You look peaceful when you sleep." The invasion of my privacy, the violation of my sense of safety, was complete. The idea that someone had been inside the house, not just once but potentially many times, watching me as I slept, was terrifying. The police were involved again, this time taking the threat more seriously. They suggested that the perpetrator might be someone from the town, possibly someone I interacted with daily. The thought that this could be someone I knew, a face I might smile at unknowingly, was horrifying. I couldn't stay in the house after that, not alone. A friend from the library stayed with me for the remaining weeks of my lease, until I could find somewhere else to live. Despite the increased vigilance, no further notes or photographs appeared, and no suspect was ever identified. The incident left its mark on me, a shadow over my memories of the town. The peace and solitude I had once sought now seemed naive, a reminder that isolation can sometimes leave us vulnerable in unexpected ways. I eventually moved back to the city, the constant noise and crowds a strange comfort. Yet the experience remains with me, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of small-town tranquility, hidden in plain sight among the familiar faces and sun-drenched streets. In the fall of 2021, as the world was slowly emerging from the shadows of the pandemic, I embarked on a journey to reinvent myself. I'm a 30-year-old male, having spent the better part of my 20s in a bustling tech startup scene in Berlin, Germany. Feeling burnt out and yearning for a change of pace, I decided to take a sabbatical and travel to Japan, a country I had long been fascinated with for its rich culture, breathtaking landscapes, and the harmonious blend of ancient traditions and cutting-edge technology. I settled in a small, secluded village in the Nagano prefecture, surrounded by mountains and forests, far removed from the neon-lit buzz of Tokyo. The village was serene, with time moving at its own languid pace, a stark contrast to the life I had known. My days were filled with long walks in the forest, learning about local customs, and occasionally helping the villagers with their daily tasks. It was a simple, fulfilling existence, or so it seemed. As autumn deepened, bringing with it a chill that whispered of the coming winter, I began to notice a peculiar figure in the village. An old man, always at a distance, watching me with an intensity that felt unsettling. His presence was constant, whether I was strolling through the village, sitting by the river, or walking along the forest's edge. Whenever our eyes met, he would turn away and disappear into the surroundings, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. Curious and a bit unnerved, I asked one of the villagers about him. They hesitated before telling me a story that sent shivers down my spine. The old man, it seemed, was a remnant of the village's darker past, a family outcast who had turned into a pariah after a series of unsettling incidents many years ago. According to the villagers, he was harmless, a lonely soul trapped in his own world of regret and sorrow. Yet the warning was clear. It was best to avoid him. Despite the advice, my intrigue got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, a part of the village's history that was kept in the shadows. My curiosity turned into an obsession, and I found myself seeking him out, trying to understand the man behind the ominous gaze. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest, I followed him at a distance. He moved with a purpose, leading me deeper into the woods than I had ever gone before. The air grew colder, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Suddenly, he stopped and turned, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. In that moment, a flood of emotions passed between us: loneliness, sadness, and a deep, unspoken understanding. He gestured for me to follow him to a small clearing where an old, weathered shrine stood, forgotten by time. There, he spoke of a tragedy that had befallen his family, one that had led to the loss of his daughter many years ago. The village, in its grief and fear, had turned against him, casting him out. He had lived on the periphery ever since, watching over the place that had once been his home, a guardian of memories that others wished to forget. As he shared his story, the air between us shifted. The eerie aura that had surrounded him dissolved, revealing a man burdened with sorrow, seeking redemption in his own way. When we parted that evening, the village and the forest no longer felt the same. They were imbued with a depth of history and emotion I'd not perceived before. The encounter changed me. I left the village not long after, carrying with me a profound sense of the complexities of human nature and the thin line between fear and understanding. The old man in the forest had become a part of my journey, a reminder that beneath the surface of every story lies a deeper truth, waiting to be uncovered. In the sweltering heat of August 2019, I found myself navigating the dense urban sprawl of Bangkok, Thailand. I was a 26-year-old female backpacker from Melbourne, Australia, on a solo journey through Southeast Asia. Bangkok, with its vibrant street life, majestic temples, and bustling markets, seemed like the perfect stop to immerse myself in a culture vastly different from my own. My adventure took an unsettling turn one evening in a popular night market in the heart of the city. The market was a sensory overload: bright lights, loud chatter, the smell of street food, and the press of the crowd. It was exhilarating, but also disorienting. I realized too late that I had strayed from the main path and found myself in a dimly lit, less crowded alleyway. That's when I noticed him, a middle-aged man, distinct in the sea of people because he wasn't moving. He was just watching me, his gaze unblinking and intense. Initially, I brushed it off as curiosity, perhaps a local unaccustomed to seeing many Western tourists in this part of the market. But as I continued to weave through the stalls, trying to find my way back to the main area, I saw him again, and again, always at a distance, always watching. Panic began to claw at me. My attempts to blend into the crowd seemed futile as his presence became more oppressive, suffocating. I decided to confront him, hoping to scare him off by making it clear that I was aware of his stalking. But when I turned to approach him, he was gone, vanished into the crowd as if he had never been there. Shaken, I hurried back to my hostel, constantly looking over my shoulder. For the next few days, I saw no sign of him and began to convince myself that I had overreacted, letting the stories of lone travelers getting into trouble abroad get the better of me. However, the sense of safety was short-lived. A few nights later, I returned to my room to find a note slipped under my door. It was crudely written in English, with just a few words. "I watch you. Nice." There was no signature, no indication of who had left it, but I knew. The man from the market had found me, even within the supposed safety of my hostel. The hostel staff were sympathetic, but could offer little in the way of help. Without a name or even a clear description in the chaos of Bangkok's streets, there was nothing to be done. I felt trapped, my adventure turning into a nightmare. The vibrant city I had been eager to explore now felt menacing, its crowded streets a labyrinth with unseen eyes always on me. I made the decision to leave Bangkok earlier than planned, booking a flight out the next day. The relief I felt as the plane took off was tainted with a bitterness. My love for travel, for the spontaneous and unknown, had been shaken by the realization that the thrill of adventure could quickly turn into vulnerability. To this day, the experience haunts me. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, has lingered, a shadow over my solo travels. The man's intentions remain a mystery, his identity unknown. But the fear he instilled in me is a stark reminder of the fine line between adventure and peril, and the importance of vigilance when stepping into the unknown.
And there we have it, folks. Our journey through the shadows,
and into the chilling depths of human nature has come to an end. I hope these tales have sent shivers down your spine, made you glance over your shoulder, or even question the ordinary moments of your daily lives. If you've enjoyed this exploration into the darker side of the human psyche, please don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. You can always share your thoughts, feelings, or even your own creepy experiences in the comments below. We love hearing from our listeners. And if you're new here or haven't yet joined our Horror Stories family, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our future tales of the macabre and mysterious. Until next time, stay safe, keep the lights on, and remember, the real monsters might be closer than you think.